Morning everybody. Today we're going to learn a bit more about Richard I, or as he was known at the time, Coeur de Lion. Okay, now that's French for Lionheart. Now if we were in the classroom I'd ask you why was he called Coeur de Lion and not Lionheart? And some of you might know the answer. In fact, his first language was French, and he didn't actually spend very much time in this country at all, even though he was King of England for 10 years. As we already know, he spent a lot of time fighting in the Crusades. In fact, during his whole 10-year reign, Richard spent probably a maximum of 6 months in England. Now, that's quite interesting if you consider that today Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart, is supposed to be one of the greatest kings that we've ever known. But he didn't really spend... Well, he spent no time in this country. His wife didn't even ever come to this country. She was Queen of England and she spent her whole life in France. And yeah, he was only here for 6 months. So that's quite an interesting fact about our greatest king. As we know, Richard spent lots of time in the Crusades, and he did manage to win quite a lot of the towns around the edge of the Holy Land, but he never, as we know, managed to get back to Jerusalem. Although he did secure some kind of peace with Saladin, the Islamic leader at the time. He is famous for lots of things. Now, you might know his symbol of the 3 lions. We still use that today. It's the symbol of the England cricket team. It's the symbol of the football team. It's still part of the royal coat of arms. If you look at the royal coat of arms, there are 3 lions on there, and they were originally Richard I. Now Richard, there's all sorts of stories floating about Richard. Lots of them we know are true, some of them we're not sure about. If you know anything about Robin Hood, he is supposed to have been a contemporary of Richard's, but we don't know much about him. We know more about Richard. One of the famous stories about Richard was that he, on his way back from fighting in the Third Crusade, lots of the people that he was fighting with had got a bit cross, and they were into fighting, if you like. So all the Europeans ended up getting sidetracked because they were fighting amongst themselves, and Richard was captured by an Austrian prince, and he was put into a castle, but nobody knew which castle he was in, and he was ransomed, and this was a proper king's ransom. And so Richard's people back in England, they taxed the poor people of England, the poor peasants and serfs. They taxed them so much that they almost bankrupted the country in order to get Richard back from the castle where he was being held prisoner. Okay, that's what a ransom is. You pay money and you exchange it for the prisoner. And the prisoner was the king, so he was worth a lot of money. This left our country, England, in a right old mess. And actually Richard was on his way back to England at the time from the Crusades, because his younger brother John was already making a right old mess in England. And he was a nasty piece of work, John. We will find out more about him next week. Anyway, back to Richard. So he's been captured by this Austrian prince, and he's been held in a dungeon somewhere. And the story goes that his faithful servant, a minstrel, he's a singer, decided to see if he could find him, and he went to all the castles in the area and sang Richard's favourite song outside the castle. And when he finally got an answer back, like a replying voice singing back the song to him, he knew that he'd found the castle where Richard was being held. So his name was Blondel. So Blondel went and stood outside the castle and sang this song, "La," and Richard, somewhere inside the castle, heard the song and replied by joining in, and that's how they found him. They couldn't get him out, but they knew then where he was being held. So that is one of the myths surrounding him. We don't know if it's really true, but it's a great story. The other thing, Richard, well, there's several things he was famous for, but he was supposed to be a very chivalrous king, and he was God-fearing. Obviously he went to fight in the Crusades, but he and was also famous for being fearsome and very well rounded in the arts of battle. So he was very good with a bow and arrow. He was very good sword fighting. He was a good strategist, plotting things, and a brilliant leader. He was actually on his way back to the Crusades when he died. Now, he was actually shot by a butcher's boy. He was just doing shooting practice, and he shot him in the leg, and he died of his injuries later. So Richard ended up not even being buried in England because he was in France at the time. He was buried in France, and he's still there today. His wife, as I said, didn't even speak English, had never even come to England. So does it mean he really was one of our greatest kings? He bankrupted the country. He didn't spend any time here, and he also let his younger brother ruin what was left of the country. So you need to decide that for yourselves. I've included an attachment which gives you some of the information I've just given you and a bit more. I will read that to you. I'll do another YouTube clip for you so you can hear me reading that out loud if you don't want to read it yourself. And then there are some questions about it that you need to answer, all about Richard. Okay, I think that's all. And I will see you next time where we're going to learn about wicked King John, or Prince John as he was at the time before he became king. Okay, brilliant.